Okay, so the focus for this week's sessions is on accessibility, and we've seen in the previous weeks that pure HTML, just unstyled, pure, boring, black and white HTML, is itself accessible, and the secret to building an accessible web design is to not mess that up in large part. So you can see that if we come back to our HTML here, we're making good use of things like semantic HTML. We're using things like the nav element for navigation, the section element for organizing a section of content here on our homepage. We've only got one H1 element, heading 1 element, and so on. So far, so good. Now, where things get interesting, especially for users with, when you're catering for users with visual impairments of various kinds, is that when you bring images in, of course we must, to make sure that, again, that they can get something out of it. All right. And so we do that by loading an image in, but also using an attribute for the image element that gives them a description that they can understand, that's clear. Okay, so it's all part of this sort of business of being inclusive in our design. And as I've mentioned in class, my philosophy is very much that accessibility is absolutely a part of design. It's as much a part of design on the web as everything else, typography, layout, all those sort of branding elements, whatever else, interactivity, things like this. Okay, so we're going to load an image in, but first we have to prepare one. So let's go through that process. So coming back to the Finder and to our folder here, we've got our home page, the About page. We've got an images folder, so that's actually where we're going to be storing the images. So far, nothing in there. I've also made something here. It's this folder called source, and I've started the file name for that folder with an underscore. Notice it has a capital S. That's just something that I like to do. It's one of my little working habits. You might prefer to keep your equivalent of this somewhere else other than the actual folder where you have the rest of your website. But the key point is that for me, this contains things that I use to build stuff like images, or site copy or things like that. That sort of things that don't wind up going up onto the web server when we're ready to make our website live. So in here I've got it's a photo that I've grabbed from Adobe Stock. I'm just going to open that in Photoshop. So it's nothing particularly interesting, but it'll do for our purposes. Oops, a second copy of that there. Now, if we go under image, grab image size, let's just have a look at its dimensions in pixels. So this is actually a pretty big image, right? Quite high resolution, 300 pixels per inch. So it's much too big for use on the web, really. And you can see that its raw size, uncompressed, is 120.7 megabytes. Now, that is absurd. We really want to get our images down to something quite small, but also something that will look good on screen. So I find that a good rule of thumb for a layout like this would be around about 1200 pixels wide as a maximum size. And we're going to size it just to fit that column across, sort of a landscape format image. So let's do that now. So I'm going to go through the width here in this image size dialog and give it a width of 1200 pixels. So these are actually device pixels. They're not like the sort of CSS unit pixel, which is more like, really a bit more like the point as a unit in terms of its actual size. So let's click on OK. Command Option 0 just to have a look at that. So I'm working on a high density screen here, on a retina display, as Apple calls them. So this is actually optically, it's about the size that we want it roughly displayed on our screen. So this will do nicely. Okay, so I'm going to keep the original file and just export out a JPEG with a little bit more compression. So going to the file menu here, down to just choosing export, and I'm going to go to export as. Right, and there's the keyboard shortcut there. Command Option Shift W. All right. So that brings up this dialog here. We probably do want it to be a JPEG. Maybe we could convert it using some sort of tool to a WebP format. We won't bother with that for now. That's sort of a slightly more advanced topic. I'm just going to drop the quality down a little bit. In other words, compress it more so that the file size is smaller. Now that does mean a drop in image quality, but we're also keeping the dimensions to a reasonable size, 1200 pixels. Yeah. So so it's not so compressed that we're going to get really bad compression artifacts, but we will get a smaller sort of file as a result. Okay. So the other options, the default options will do, they'll be fine. So I'm just going to click on export here. That'll bring up a save dialog, and I want to go to OneDrive, to my project folder. Now, I do actually want to save this to my images folder here. And I'm going to give it a more descriptive file name. So again, all lowercase, no spaces. So web servers don't particularly like to encounter spaces in file names. So let's call it Designer Desk with Laptop. I'm just separating out those words with little dashes here. I could use underscores, but a little dash is just fine. Okay, so I'm just going to save that there. So again, under the images folder there. All right, so far so good. Okay, so I'm going to close this file now, again without saving it, because I want to keep the original. Perhaps I might want to come back to it later and reuse it at a larger size for something, maybe a full page background or something like that, in which case I'll need something a bit bigger than 1200 pixels. Okay, so we need to load this into the web page. So this task we can actually pretty adequately do just in the HTML. So I'm going to come back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to put the image in, well, I put it just in here. Okay. And I want to actually run it full width across that column. So the element is the image element, or imig, it's the img for image. One thing that you'll notice is that the older HTML tags, such as image, h1 and so on, they're much more concise, maybe a bit too abbreviated. These days we tend to use somewhat longer, more self-explanatory tag names. Okay, so we need to tell it to load the image. So I'm going to use the source attribute, src. Okay, Source not, source set. We get onto that source set more in second year. That's for images that are suitable for really for loading in different image sizes for responsive design. We're not going to bother with that for the time being. Okay, so we need to again make a path, declare a path here to that image so we can see it. Here it is under the images folder. You can see that in the Explorer here. There's the folder there. So just as when we're loading in our CSS up here, we need to say the folder, name of the folder that's in, put a / and then the name of the document. Okay, difference is here, we're using a source attribute rather than an href attribute. So we're embedding the image into the page itself. So I'm going to say images, and look, code has given me a prompt here with the file name. Okay, and it's hopefully putting in a / there as well. That means look inside that folder, and it's prompting me with the image that it can see is inside that folder. So boom, there we go. Got the path to that image there. So the name of the folder, which is images, / which says look inside that folder, and then grab this here. Now we need a couple of other things. We need to size it with the width attribute. Width will do because we want to constrain it according to the width of the column that it's in. I'm just going to say 100%. So it should go flexibly across that width, because of course the web is a bit of a squishy, squashy medium. You know, it's things vary in size according to the size of the screen that you're on, the size of the window, and so on. All right, so that should work. One thing about the image tag, though, is that like the link element, the image tag rather, is self-closing. So there's no actual need for a closing tag. There's no such tag that looks like, you can see it's actually trying to help me here. There's no such thing as a closing image tag like that. It just doesn't exist. If you were to put it in, it would just be ignored. So it's a self-closing tag, self-closing element. So I'm going to put in a / again there. It's just a nice little visual reminder. Oh yes, this one does not have a closing tag. Self-closing. All right, so let's go back to the browser. Refresh it, and boom, there we've got our image there. And you can see that its width is constrained not by its size in pixels, but by the width of the containing box element there. Okay, and you can see that squishing down a little bit as I make that window narrower. So that's all very nice. Okay, but the one thing that we need to do is to make sure that this is accessible to everyone. Those of us who have good eyesight, this is not a problem. We can see what it is. Okay, so what do we do? Well, I mentioned before that there's an attribute that we need to put in here, and that attribute is alt, meaning alternative. So it's the alternative text. So if you can't see the image, you can maybe get the text description. So I'm going to say it's a Mac laptop sitting on desk showing design software. Okay, so that's pretty clear. One way to think about writing alt text is to imagine you were talking to a friend over the telephone. This is how I do it anyway, I think. Well, if I had to describe the photo that I'm looking at to someone over the phone, what's the kind of thing I would say? I'm not going to give an exhaustive description. I just want to say what it is so they can understand. And that's what we need to do for the sake of accessibility. So it's not something vague, it's really quite specific, but it's also not very long. All right. So the other advantage is that sometimes the web server will fail to send an image out. Maybe it's just a bit overloaded or something else goes wrong, and you just don't get the image. Maybe the image has been inadvertently moved. You maybe one of your colleagues has moved it or renamed it, and it just fails to load. In that case, just the text will still show up. So let's have a look at that. I'll just mess around with the file name here and put in something that messes that up. Just adding the word nope to the end of that file name. Let's see what happens. All right, so I come back to the browser, Command R, and look, it's failed to load. Perhaps you've seen this before. This sort of little question mark or something like this appear in the browser. It still shows the size of the image appropriately. It's displaying it as a square because it doesn't actually know how high it should be, but it does know how wide it should be. It should be the width of the containing box. But look at this. Our alt text is there, readable for us as well. Okay, so that's pretty handy. So it means that if something does go wrong loading the image, even for those of us who have no accessibility issues, that's going to work perfectly well. All right, but of course we want that to function, so I'll correct that file name, and boom, there it is. And we know that this is a nice accessible image, that we've done a decent job there. All right, no further things we could do. We could put a caption underneath, but this is enough for now.